Hello everyone, I'm Wendell Jones and welcome to this edition of the program Jones and Company. On this program we examine the national issues of the Bahamas. It has been 4 months or so since the government changed in the Bahamas, and on our program every week we try to bring different perspectives, and we are going basically week for week almost with government and opposition politicians on this particular program. And so on our program today, we are pleased to have the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and the former Member of Parliament for the Foxhill constituency and Senator currently, the Honourable Fred Mitchell, who is our guest on the program today. He's always in the news, but he always has some very powerful things to say, and that is why we've invited him here on Jones and Company. Senator, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be back.
Godfrey, nice to see you.
Thank you.
You know, we are celebrating yet another anniversary of this company, and Godfrey tells me that you are always the first guest on Jones and Company. We've had so many over the last 23 years or so, but it's always a pleasure to have you here. And as I said, you've been very active in the last few weeks. You have been concerned about the rising level of crime in Foxhill. I'm sure you had a whole lot of press about that, but I'm sure it also distressed you, eh?
I think from a personal point of view, because particularly when it started affecting very young people. Mm-hmm. You know, this particular cycle started on or about the 27th of August, when the little children were in the swimming pool at the Foxhill Community Center. And I went by after leaving a church service in Foxhill to check to see, you know, whether they were still there. And the neighbors came along and said, well, they went home early. So I asked them, well, what happened? They said that a few minutes before I got there, gunshots had been fired in the area, and the lifeguards decided that it was safer for them to withdraw to a safe place and then dispatch them home. So I immediately wrote a note the next day to the Commissioner of Police and copied the Minister of National Security. Silence in response to it. And then every day after that, gunshots going off, gunshots going off. So I made a public statement and I said, look, this neighborhood is experiencing this problem and you need to put additional resources in there. And I'm satisfied the local police officer does what he can, but you need a kind of national effort to figure out what's going on, because the neighbors were saying there's a kind of tit-for-tat war going on over drug turf in the area, which is causing these gunshots to be fired. And sometimes people would call me in their homes and they say they're crouching in their homes and would you please do something. So ultimately we had to make it a public matter. And
is this new in Foxhill? I seem to recall that you had quite a number of homicides in Foxhill in recent years.
Well, you know, it dates back before this, but the most egregious example of this, if you want to put it that way, of course, is December 27, 2013, when 4 people were gunned down on the Freedom Park. Right. That case has not come to trial. Up to now, not come to trial. So you can imagine,
been charged?
People have been charged. I gather people are out on bail, but it's not come to trial. So I don't know what even the quality of the evidence would be at this point. But the fact is there are these gaping wounds, and we've tried various mechanisms, and one of the reasons why urban renewal is in Foxhill is precisely to try and deal with these issues, but that's now crippled. It doesn't operate as it's supposed to operate. So social intervention is obviously part of the answer, but the major part of the answer when you're faced with physical violence is that you've got to put someone with a countervailing force in there. And it just didn't seem to be any concern about this. Now, one way of thinking is you get people, for example, a lady sent me a text, says, oh, it's just the bad boys killing off one another, and when they finish killing one another, it'll stop. But the problem with that is, of course, is that if the bullet misses one of the bad boys and hits one of the good people, I mean, so you can't just let it go unchecked. And so that's how I got involved in this, you know. And everybody thinks it's a political crusade. Well, I'm a politician. I'm unapologetic about that. But it takes leadership to galvanize public opinion, and that's what part of my role is.
Mr. Mitchell, obviously, the root of the problem is the community. And I think Fox Hill is an area which has gone through a period of transition in terms of its residents. And I think the old Fox Hillians are probably now a minority, and you think that could be the root of the problem, that there's a different kind of personality now residing in Fox Hill?
I'm not sure, because I don't want to say that Fox Hill is unique, because this, I believe, is a problem which is society-wide, at least in the urban areas of this country. So I'm not sure that's correct. What I would say is that after the press conference took place, when the residents themselves spoke to the issue, I had a very heartfelt conversation with two young men who actually organized the press conference. They said, you know, look, we saw you standing on the park talking about this by yourself. We want to make sure that people know that people stand behind this. So that was arranged the next day when the community itself came together. But what they talked about was the fact that in this square mile, so to speak, down in Congo Town, which is close to Adderley Street and opposite St. Augustine's, people are literally afraid to come around the park area, and vice versa. And so it appears that there's been some tit-for-tat rivalry going on between those two sides for a long time. And when he said it, I recalled a story that the Reverend Philip Ramming, Dr. Philip Ramming, told me about the original split between Mount Carey and St. Paul's, where the Congos were the latter arrivals to Fox Hill and didn't speak English, obviously, because they had just come. And so were considered kind of second tier to the Yorubas and their descendants. And that was a fault line in the church, which exacerbated itself. And according to St. Paul's history, they moved from Mount Carey down to St. Paul's. Now, what Reverend Ramming said to me was that as a little boy, he was told by his mother, don't go chasing or running after those Congos down in the bottom. That's what he was told. And so you ask yourself whether this is a rivalry which dates way back in time, because some of the residents now say that it's a problem that can never be solved because it's just historical and it's traditional. Now, you know, I'm in public policy, so my view is that if there's a problem, the problem can be solved.
You think they know the difference between the residents who are Congos and who are Yorubas in Fox Hill today?
Well, I don't think they may identify as that, but I'm saying neighborhoods, because, and there were two women, there was a meeting I went to at Carmichael, two women came up to me afterwards, and they were exercised about the fact that this has been made a public issue, public problem. And then they said this, my children are terrified to go beyond where Chanel Ferguson's headquarters exists in Fox Hill. And so what that means is that that's along Bernard Road, just up from St. Augustine's College. Mm-hmm. So it means, again, the marking line is do not go near the park. And the people near the park, they say, are afraid to go down into that area. So they repeated that story. And I said to them, well, why? She in fact said that one of her sons had been marked for death within 3 days, she'd been told. I said, why haven't you spoken to the police? No, you can't go to the police, because if you speak to the police, they go and tell these people, and then the situation will be worse. And that's what you are facing. Now, what does a politician do? Yeah. What does a politician do?
Tell me, we have a national security issue going on, Godfrey, in the Bahamas today. We have a new government. I don't know. I see from time to time in the newspapers various pronouncements. I see another new strategy that has been announced by the acting commissioner of police. What is happening with national security?
Well, you know, I asked rather facetiously this question. I said, has anyone seen the commissioner of police? He's been missing in action. You know, half the PLP is supposed to get locked up because all of us are crooked, dishonest, corrupt, so on and so forth. The week before, of course, he says, I don't see any evidence of it. I hear a lot of talk, but no one has come back and make a complaint. Then he disappears, and then these arrests take place, and then we hear nothing more from him. And then, of course, the situation in Fox Hill, we hear nothing from him. What I do know is a letter was issued prior to Sunday the 17th by the now substantive Commissioner of Police, Ellison Greenslade, that said, I'm going on holiday for 3 weeks, and I'll be back on the 17th. So the 17th comes, and I asked the people last night, has anyone seen the Commissioner of Police? Because you tell them if you see him that the PLP is looking for him, because we need his voice, some central authority that people will respond to in a unified fashion. Well, surprise, surprise, we get a letter today saying, fellas, I'm on holiday again till the 24th of October and give your support to the acting police. Now, I'm making light of it, but the more serious point is that you need leadership in the force to drive the force, and not temporary leadership. You need permanent leadership. The other thing which seems to be at work, as far as we can tell, is that you know the history of Greenslade and Dames. Dames is now the Minister of National Security.
What is the history?
The history is that the two of them were at one time candidates for the choice of Commissioner of Police. They went away to Canada, special training, so on and so forth. And then when they came back, the FNM chose Greenslade to be the commissioner. So they must have known why they chose him. He was the better candidate, one assumes. Except that history and fate would have it, Mr. Dames is now the minister. So the minister, ever wanting to be commissioner, now is going to be commissioner and minister at the same time. And commissioner has gone on holiday while this is taking place. So fine, if that's your strategy, come clean on the strategy, right? If you are directing what's happening, but let us know what your strategy is. So, surprise, surprise, House of Assembly meets, and we get a 56-page communication laying out a strategy on fighting crime, which is precisely what Bernard Nottage, the Minister of National Security, would have said last year. Not a single word changed, nothing different, except it looks as if they want to scrap the electronic monitoring system. They're blaming that for the problems, right? But the serious and underlying point is that crime is a very complex problem. The leader of the opposition issued a statement today saying that obviously the approach now has to be bipartisan. Okay, we've socked each other in the eye. It's your fault. It's my fault. Yeah, this is your, we've gone through that. Now it's a genuine effort has to be made to see if we can work together to see if we can resolve the issues. Because you can't have, 16-year-olds being, 16 years old? I mean, what have you experienced at 16? What could you have possibly taken from another 16-year-old that deserves your life being taken?
But there's no political solution, Mr. Mitchell, to this crime problem. This is a societal issue.
And I'm with you there. I'm saying, though, that I said to some former constituents who came up to talk to me about this today, I said to them, where are the neutral civic organizations addressing the problem of what we do?
Yes.
Where are they? And the only reason we get involved in it, or I'm involved in it, because it's a default position. There's silence all around. You have people complaining, so you give voice to their complaints. Now, I take the good with the bad. There's a benefit and a burden. They say, oh, you're a PLP, and I guess that means we must be lower than dirt because the PLP says it. But the fact is they've now responded to it. And they could, scream as much as they want. This one won't shut up, They can't shut me up. And that's my line, because it's the country. You can't afford to have 16-year-olds being popped off in the flower of their life. It should not happen.
Mr. Mitchell, in view of the fact that they have called for a bipartisan approach,
right,
what is the PLP going to bring to the table?
Our experience, our ideas in crime fighting. We've had, 10 years in government in the most recent incarnation. We are citizens of the country. We have ideas. We can speak to those who support us in the community and say, look, you need to come to the table and we need to get together to see what we can do. Because a lot of people have said, look, why don't you speak to the parents of these kids? Because they are the ones who are the controlling factor. It's the parents. But look at the history of our country. Parents who themselves aren't emotionally, psychologically, and socially developed. So it's a very complex thing, and that's why the institutions, the coach of the basketball team, the headmaster in the school, ends up being the person who brings some order out of this chaos.
Yeah. Is this the #1 challenge for you and for the country, you think, this matter of crime?
I think so. I think so, and it's a manifestation of a lot of underlying issues which we have to address.
Okay.
And clearly, education is a key factor to this. And so, I think that resources need to be put behind it. I mean, it grieves me that in a country that is relatively wealthy, that kids go to LW Young, a school that is falling apart. I had to write the Minister of Education. I said, man, I see you getting up here announcing that you build a brand new school in the south of New Providence when LW Young is falling apart. It's beyond its shelf life. I think the building was supposed to be for 20 years, one of these prefab buildings. Last year, the whole facade fell off the front of the school.
Is that right?
When I went to the school, we were asked to go and inspect prior to school opening. Air conditioning not working, the teachers sweating, not even the air conditioning in their own rooms, everything, the electrical faults, so on and so forth. And you can't apparently depend on the Ministry of Works to repair anything because you call them, they come, inspect, nothing's done. Why should children in this relatively wealthy country be going into a school like that?
So you think LW Young should
be replaced? And Jerome Fitzgerald, when as the Minister of Education, had made a decision that what you do is you'd allocate funding year after year and replace one building after the next building with traditional concrete block construction. And that would have been the way to do it.
Yeah.
What role is school boards playing in alleviating some of these problems?
Well, I think they do a yeoman's service as such, but in traveling around the Bahamas, I've said this very often, and I say it again here, there is no problem that I have seen in this country that money can't resolve. And school boards do not have the funding. That's the issue. They want to do a lot of things, but they just don't have the funding to do it. And so, it's reorienting priorities, perhaps. If there isn't sufficient funding now, maybe we have to reallocate because the children are really where we should be putting the money. Okay. That's my feeling.
Let's take this break here. This is Jones and Company, and Senator Fred Mitchell, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, our guest today. We'll come right back. We're back here on the program Jones and Company, and we are having a conversation with Senator Fred Mitchell. And Senator, we note with interest that the Progressive Liberal Party has a convention coming up, and you are not running for the leadership nor the deputy leadership of the party.
No, I'm not.
Why?
I'm not a member of Parliament, and I decided that even though the rules don't require it, I think that effectively, unless you wanted to end up in a situation like the F&M did last year, effectively you need the leader and deputy leader to be in the House. So that was the decision.
But you're a senator. You're in the upper house.
But it's a derived power, So anytime somebody wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, you're gone, and that platform had disappeared. So that was just my view. It's a peculiar view, and a lot of people have tried to persuade me otherwise. But I think that's the view.
Can you tell us who you're supporting?
Brave Davis.
Brave Davis?
Yes, right. No question. Yeah.
Why?
I think that there's a requirement now for stabilizing presence. The history of the PLP is largely hierarchical. So when the #1 goes, the #2 gets it. That's what I think is the mood of the organization. And so you need to have someone who is in that position who can basically stabilize things, who's able to put and employ resources toward doing all of the reform measures which are necessary. And I think he lends a presence to that. He's in fact been the kind of Mr. Fix-It for a generation. And in a sense, it's his turn.
What is the mood of the PLP?
I think people are enlivened and excited by the opportunity that we return to normalcy in the sense that, people's ambitions can be expressed and that, you're going to have a good contest and there's a promise to return to conventions every year. I think people will love that.
What do you say about the last 4 months of the new government? I know that you've been in the newspapers on various issues, but to summarize it, what do you think of their first 4 months?
Well, you know, I told PLPs they got a term, this new government has 60 months in the administration, 4 are down and 56 to go. And we have a lot of work to do in those 56 months, each day, trying to get the Bahamian people to accept the PLP as the next administration for this country. So one of the things I've been trying to do is to get people to stop wringing their hands and say, oh, we lost this election on the 10th of May, how dreadful, how terrible. A lady who's a former teacher from Sounders Primary School saw me in the supermarket. She said, boy, I was going to call you, but then I hear you saying on that note you sent around, don't come telling me I'm sorry up in the supermarket. Say, you don't want to hear that, right? So I wouldn't call you. But I mean, that's my view. Enough of that now, you know? Let's get moving. And I think we're really at that point now. You know, conventions coming up, so we're at that point. And I think you've got enough of a demonstration to see over these 4 months where these fellas are headed. Took a vacation, came back with no legislation, adjourned the House again, came back on the 13th of September, came back on the 20th of September, read some communications, and then adjourned the House again. So it shows you that they don't have a program, they don't have an agenda. And it's just the PLP is crooked, the PLP is dishonest, the PLP did this. They open up the files, oh look what the PLP did, and they're still doing that. Well, that's going to run out at some point. I warn them, put money on the ground in Grand Bahama, or you're going to have a problem. You're going to have social disorder. And that's exactly what's happening. The morale in Grand Bahama is low. There's no employment there. There's no cash on the ground there. And that's what we face. So, you know, you don't wish them to be unwell, but you observe the fact that they're not as prepared as they should have been for the business of government. And Minnis is now developing the reputation of being the Prime Minister of touring. I said to a PLP meeting the other day, he must have been to church on Sunday, you know, and prayed for this hurricane to come. Because when the hurricane comes, he doesn't have to answer any questions about public policy. He just says, I think he had a national address, and he told people, what did he say? Say, oh, take the hurricane seriously. A national address, you know, on a hurricane that the forecasters have already said is probably going to skirt the eastern edge of the country. I'm not trying to minimize it, but the fact is it's time for us to get back to work on substantive issues. And one of the substantive issues, for example, is to take the hurricane, because there are a lot of policy issues which are connected with the hurricane. I issued a policy document in consultation with the leader of the opposition, in my role as shadow foreign minister. And I said, should we not now, in the Caribbean and in the Bahamas, turn our attention to the actual practical problems of the weather as we find it? We know that climate change is the underlying issue. We also know that we're in a problem with the United States that its leaders do not now agree that that's the issue. But we also know that the weather is bad, and it's ruining the shoreline, and it's taking the roofs off the houses. You look at what happened in Dominica, and you look at what happened in Barbuda, and it has to do with the codes, it has to do with the protections of the seawalls. So our countries have to all now concentrate on what do we do to mitigate and adapt. And should we not turn our attention to that? I think that would be a useful thing for Dr. Minnis to do with his administration, to gather with other CARICOM leaders and determine how we are going to finance mitigation and adaptation. That's the issue.
But Mr. Mitchell, is a bigger problem than that. In many of these Caribbean islands, there's been total disruption, because all of them are principally tourism destinations. And the infrastructure has been virtually eliminated, you know, when you look at the northern Eastern Caribbean. And the second problem is, most of these countries don't produce any food.
That's right. You're absolutely right. And so that's why I'm saying the focus has to be, for example, one of the issues the Bahamas has to face is, of all the hurricanes that took place, Joaquin, then Irma, Harvey, and Matthew in the last 3 years, of all the hurricanes that have affected this country, none of them have actually been a direct hit on New Providence. And this is the engine of the country. So our planners, our leaders ought to be thinking of that scenario. What happens if something happened like what happened in Puerto Rico and in Dominica? The hurricane passes directly over New Providence with 155-mile-an-hour winds. What do we do? Are we ready? And how fast can we get our infrastructure back up? I mean, I was looking at the modalities or the methods that the present government employed in looking at the hurricane damage or responding to the hurricane. Okay, and here's what it is we've done this from Jean, Francis, Wilma, Michelle, Irma, Matthew. Hurricane happens, we jump on a plane the next day, we go down to the communities, we inspect with the cameras, all the politicians are there, we look, and then we come back and say, okay, we're going to get the public service and get them going. But I thought to myself as I saw Jeff Lloyd standing up in the abandoned school in Ragged Island, why didn't you just get on a boat and bring the tractors the same time with the contractors, just start building the school back? What you got to wait for? You don't have to come and inspect damage to see it. We know the damage is there. Your people, your eyes on the ground could have told you the damage. Just get to work.
This is a criticism you're making now of successive governments,
yes,
including the PLP government.
Right, well, that's what I said. That's the modality we've been from. But you know, these folk came to office saying they were going to be different from us. As a matter of fact, their partisan supporters have said, oh, you know, Dr. Minnis has been so proactive, this is so new, this is so different. And I said to my branch when I was speaking to them, I said, look, you know, if you took Dr. Minnis's picture out of these pictures taken today and you stuck Perry Christie's picture in there, you wouldn't notice the difference, because that's the same thing that was done last year.
Is NEMA ready? NEMA as an organization to get us where we ought to be in terms of hurricane preparedness and how we respond to these hurricanes?
My impression is that they have the training. My impression is they have the capacity. I think the resources, that's the issue. I don't think they have sufficient resources to mobilize in time. For example, we were a bit panicked during the summertime when we understood that of the 9 boats that the new Defense Force boats, 5 of them were not operational, and 3 of the the 3 aircraft were not operational. So there are a lot of things that have to do to support what NEMA does. And there's, this country has a bureaucratic problem. We love paper and we love filling out forms, when in fact what you need to do is to deliver the goods straight away.
Mr. Mitchell, our region has serious financial resources limitations. All right? We also know that our region is the most vulnerable region among the small island development states in terms of natural disasters, right? I hold the view that in view of the fact that these colossal hurricanes are increasing in frequency, we're going to have to rely on outside sources for funding. Now, you were in Addis Ababa at when the global community met to generate funds to address the issues of vulnerability for small island development states, right? What is being done to activate that so that the Caribbean, in its present dilemma, can get some assistance?
Well, the problem is this. The Green Climate Fund, which came out of that process in Ethiopia, is supposed to be $100 billion. The developed countries supposedly accepted the responsibility for the creation of this problem that we now find.
Yes.
And they were supposed to put aside $100 billion. So far, only $10 billion have been set aside. And now you find the United States has said they're not going to contribute at all. So they're not part of it because they're withdrawing from the climate fund arrangements. CARICOM, I'm advised, is convening a donors conference in a short while as a result of these present hurricanes. I think the Canadians have said that they will participate. I imagine the United States will participate, and other countries. And the French, yeah, given their colonies, and the Dutch as well. So that is going to happen. But I fear that at the end of the day, given that countries and the international institutions have not accepted the GDP per capita is not the measure to determine whether you get concessionary loans. I fear that we're going to have to do what the Bahamas did last year. And
borrow some money.
You had to go and borrow money from the market. Because
not from the fund.
Right. If you get it from the Green Climate Fund, you get it at very low interest rates. Yeah. But if you have to go to the market, that's an issue.
This in insurance business, does it make sense? The PLP government withdrew from this Caribbean insurance company. The Minister administration decided that they would pay. What do you say?
I think we wisely made the decision on advice that given the track record of payments, given the way the insurance was written and the triggers which were in the insurance, that it was not providing value to the extent that we expected. And so the advice was to self-insure, which would essentially mean that you set aside the sum of money that you would normally pay to the insurance in a fund, and then you just draw down on that if you needed to do so for infrastructure. So that was the thinking.
But governments don't have the discipline for that.
They may not, but I made another suggestion in this policy paper, which I think the leader of the opposition has accepted. My own view was that, as I said, my criticism of the approach to this hurricane relief effort is it is overly bureaucratic. And my view is that the thing should be privatized in this sense. You know that there's a deposit corporation for banks. In other words, if you have an amount in a bank which is below 50,000 and the bank goes under, you get your 50,000 back because there's insurance which is covering that deposit up to 50,000. So I said, what if you have, the government have an insurance company and everybody's home is guaranteed up to a certain level and you pay an insurance, or the government makes a deposit to that insurance per household, and that takes care of an individual household's needs should it be triggered in a hurricane. So you can do that by legislation.
But what about the fact that the insurance company may say, if you got $1 million house and the government insurance is only $50,000, you're uninsured?
No, I'm saying this, that you can write specific triggers which deal with a specific amount. For example, during Hurricane Matthew, I would dare say that $2,500 given to each householder, they could have fixed their own house. And just say, look, here's a one-off cash payment. And I said that to the government. You know, it's just cheaper for you. All this nonsense about come in, fill a form, go inspect, do this, do the next thing. Just say to the householder, $2,500 is what the government has given. Go knock yourself out once you fix the house, once you fix the roof. And I think people, that's what I mean by privatizing the function. So it's not a government function of making the repairs. Now the question for the general insurance that you're talking about is about the infrastructure. And that's where the argument ensued. I think they said in Hurricane Joaquin that it was a flooding event and not a wind event. And so therefore the insurance didn't pay. Well, everybody was quite surprised at that. And of course they go back and read the fine print. Yeah, that's what it says. So insurance company gets away. So the idea was to sit down with CRIF and say, here is what we want to do. We want to redefine the terms of the insurance. And in the meantime, we'll just set aside the money for ourselves. Now, another government can come and make another decision. They have the authority, they have the power. What I don't like is for them to suddenly say the PLP was lying, the PLP was dishonest, so on and so forth. If you want to make that decision, go do it on your own. Don't blame us. We made a decision. We were properly advised. We made the right decision. We had the authority to make the decision. You make another decision. You could explain your decision. That's your decision. And of course, you're the government, so you do it.
When we return, Mr. Mistral, we want to talk a little bit more about statecraft, and there are some questions I'm sure Mr. Enos would have for you on that as well. We take this break here on Jones and Company. We'll come right back. We are back here on our program, Jones and Company, in the final segment of our program as we continue our conversation with Mr. Fred Mitchell. Senator, statecraft. From my experience in journalism and watching politicians in this country, few of them understand it. And you have made some points on this program today about the insurance, for instance. I just wonder, sir, the level of preparedness on the part of politicians and people who have positions in the government of the Bahamas, whether they understand our country, they understand our region, and the way we ought to be governing ourselves.
Well, it's a very glamorous job. I mean, I wonder why, there must be gold in the House of Assembly, I said the last time, the number of people who want to run for the House, and that's fine. It's good that people want to be involved in democracy. But it isn't just jumping up in the House of Assembly and then spouting off your mouth saying anything you want to say. And I think that's what most people see. It's just, great, I can get up and I can sound off and say whatever I want to say. No, you're actually trying to do things, the Constitution says, for the peace and good order of the country. So it means that you have to have a familiarization with its institutions, how they work, how they interact, and then how to mobilize people behind objectives. And I think that too often people just pop up, and particularly given the level of dissatisfaction that the public had for the Progressive Liberal Party in the last, as evidenced in the result of the last campaign, you can just get very lucky and come with a wave, and then you have this huge majority, 35-4, and then you think that you are the Messiah, that you know everything, that you've descended from heaven, and that everything that you say is just littered with gold. And of course, that's not true. That's not so. The problems remain, and the problems are practical problems, as Marvin Dames, the Minister of National Security, is now finding out, as Jeff Lloyd. I tease him in other fora by saying, you're no longer, a talk show host. It's not you as Minister of Education describing problems anymore. Mr. Minister, the school is leaking, the roof got to be fixed. And you can't be sounding off and saying, education for our children must be this and that and so on and so forth. But it's your job to fix it now. And that's the issue. So I've had the opportunity in the last days to speak to the politics and government class at the University of the Bahamas. I gave them this story. I said, look, gentlemen, ladies, when I taught this class in the spring of 1988, subbing for Felix Bethel, there were two people that I remember from that class in particular. One was Mike Halkitis, the other was Reynard Rigby. Within 13 years of their leaving the University of the Bahamas, Mike Halkitis was a parliamentary secretary and a member of parliament, and Reynard Rigby was the chairman of the governing party. And I said, when they got there, they had to have a fixed idea of what it is they were going to do and try to accomplish. I said, so you have a very short time in between where you are now and the time when your time comes up to the plate. And you've got to, this is the time now for you to be thinking about, how do I solve these problems? What do I do? I'm here to tell you in this class, not why things are the way they are. I'm just telling you what they are. These are the institutions. This is how it works. You're in the midst of the Pax Americana. The Pax Americana operates in a certain way in the international arena, and the local arena has a certain way it interacts with, and you have to learn that. And when you get there, your feet running straight away. There's no time to think anymore.
Mr. Mitchell, when Mahatma returned from South Africa to India, the first thing he did, he toured India. But he was going to the Bahamas, right? And that's a big problem You got to know your country if you want to serve your country. All right? Now how you going to fix that, Mr. Mitchell?
Well, I tried in my limited way, and you know, got a lot of grief ex post facto for this. But every time I traveled as minister, we took a Foreign Service officer with me, in addition to the aides who traveled with me. The reason, and it was done on a rotation. And the reason that was done was to expose them to how being a minister actually operates, because one day one of them may be a minister, or to see how you do logistics for a trip when you're going overseas, to meet people in other islands and get to know them, and so you can always call on them because you develop relationships. Because I said to them, you know, the Bahamas is a country which is run by the consent of the governed. This is not a dictatorship. This is democracy, and so therefore, and it's not just Nassau. So that was one of the ways. And I was just surprised at the number of people who had never been to Freeport. I mean, I just can't imagine that you have never been to Freeport. I mean, this whole place that was invented out of the pine forest in 1955, which is a miracle city, and people have not seen it. The kids from the basketball team at Doris Johnson, I mean, they couldn't believe it when they landed there and saw the roads. I mean, they thought, gee, you know, this is actually the Bahamas.
Yeah. People don't understand the country.
That's right.
Don't know the country.
You have people in policy positions in this country don't know the country.
You have people in the Parliament of the Bahamas who don't know the country, who have not been to most of the islands of the Bahamas.
Right.
And they're making policy decisions and laws for the Bahamas. They don't know the country.
So when we did the select committee request, the select committee on the benefits to parliamentarians, one of the things we got the F&M to agree to, and it was adopted by the Parliament, is that members of Parliament should have, for themselves and an aide, the ability to travel once a month on Bahamas Air at the expense of the government. Because we felt that members of Parliament and senators represent, I mean, even though you're elected on the basis of a geographical constituency, you in fact represent the whole Bahamas. And so you ought to have the opportunity to be able to go across the whole Bahamas during the tenure of your senatorship or your membership in the House.
Mr. Mitchell, there's one criticism I have of the PLP. I think the PLP, yeah, just one at this time. And that criticism is that I think one of the mistakes the PLP made was that it engendered in the electorate this feeling of entitlement. All right?
Yeah.
And the example Wendell uses is that if his house roof blows off, you expect him to fix it.
Yeah, I found that.
But many people in this country expects the government to fix it.
Yeah, I found that. And that's a difficult problem to overcome. But
no, but it's been gendered by the political directorate.
Well, I would use that as a more generic term, you know, because as you speak, I remember, and I tell this to the younger ones in the PLP who are railing against all of these practices, because I think they think many of the things are unfair that constituents ask you about. And one of them is that the favorite whipping boy is of the younger ones is giving out hams and turkeys at Christmas time. And I said to them, you know, I was 21 years old and I'm sitting in front of Sir Lyndon Pinley and I'm doing the same thing. I'm saying, oh, Joe, shame of yourself, you know, giving out turkeys and hams at Christmas time. He says, when are you all going to end this stuff, right? And he sits there and he looks at me with this bemused look. He says, my friend, you know, maybe in your lifetime, not in mine. And he just chuckled, right? And now I'm sitting telling these younger ones, I say, my brother, you know, maybe in your lifetime, not in mine. That's just one of these practices amongst others.
But aren't you responsible as a policymaker, as a politician in the country, to inspire people and to get them to aspire to certain things, to change their mindset about how we do politics and how we do government in the Bahamas? Because all of these parties are about the same thing. I mean, there were some people who came down, who were evacuated from Acklands, who didn't want to go back, and the They thought that the government should take care of them. Why don't we disabuse people of this notion in the Bahamas that the government is supposed to do everything for them?
Well, I think the problem is that it comes back again to where are the independent civic voices to make this point? Because the problem is the politician is in the midst of the vortex, so to speak. It's difficult to make that decision if you're in the vortex. But if there's some support which is coming forward, but I'm sure that, you go and make that decision, then the word goes out, so-and-so is mean, he don't do this, and so on and so forth. Who wants to
I think the problem is that too many politicians go there and they work for their re-election rather than working for the smooth governance of the country.
Well,
you're concerned about being re-elected.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's part of being a politician. If you want to be a politician, you want to be re-elected. That's so. And statesmen only become.
Yeah, but what about the national interest?
No, but the two are not mutually exclusive, though. They're not mutually exclusive. You can work toward re-election even as you try to reform, and reform is incremental. That's what I'm saying. There are very few occasions when there's going to be a revolution. Very few occasions, but bit by bit. And that's why the youngsters are your solution, ultimately. The youngsters are your solution. And I say to them each time, these are some things you got to tackle.
The democracy works best, Mr. Mitchell, when people are properly educated, properly informed about how their country works.
Sure.
We cannot have a proper democracy when people do not understand the country, they are not educated about the government or governance in the country. How can you get proper governments when people are ignorant about how these things are supposed to be operated?
No, I'm with you, and that's a very complex problem that the Ministry of Education and others have to suggest. But I suffer from the same issue. I mean, that kids who, for example, live in Foxhill, which is the center of the Emancipation Day celebrations and observances, but don't know what is Emancipation Day. You go to the school and say, what is Emancipation Day?
It's a holiday.
No idea what the date is. In one case, it was actually, the reason I asked the question is because the date was actually up on the wall, saying 1st August 1834, Emancipation Day. And they passed this sign up and down every day. I asked them, what is Emancipation Day? They don't know. University students don't know. What is GDP per capita?
Then you should fire the headmistress or headmaster.
No, I mean, but I'm
that's
saying,
their responsibility, Minister.
No, I understand, but it's the state of things. So, to a certain extent, politicians have to deal with the state of things as they find them. And often you end up, as a practical matter, taking the line of least resistance.
Mr. Mitchell, we have come to the end of the program, and I know that Godfrey wants to ask you about 10 more questions, and I have about 20 more, but we are...
Once he doesn't have any criticisms of the PLP, I said only one.
Oh, we have many criticisms of the PLP, and we didn't reach to some of these criticisms today, so we need you to come back soon.
Look, and I think, I just want to say, fine, it's a great organization. It's not a perfect organization, and I think people working on reforms, regardless of who wins the leadership race. And I commend the organization to this country. It's needed, and we are coming back, and I think we'll do better next time.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Godfrey. Thank you for watching and listening to our program. Good evening, everyone.